Hi, and welcome to the Candice Malcolm Show. Just given everything that's happening in the world, in the United States, up here in Canada, over the last few days, I thought it would be a great idea to sit down with my friend Leo Knight. Leo is a True North Fellow. He's also a former Canadian police officer, a security expert, and a media commentator. He is an expert on all things related to crime and justice, and he is the founder and editor of the website Primetime Crime. Leo, thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
So everyone's trying to make sense of what is going on with these protests. It seems to me like they were sparked by a very legitimate sort of movement of seeing a really gruesome murder or death on behalf of a police officer. It seemed really unjust. And I think that there was near universal condemnation towards that officer and outcry about the killing of George Floyd. But what we saw was that the protest kind of morphed into something different. They turned sort of violent, and it no longer really seems to be about that one instance of police brutality. It sort of just morphed into a general anti-American, anti-capitalist protest. I just want to right off the bat, what do you make of the protest? I mean, do you think these protesters are hurting their own cause when they turn violent?
Oh, absolutely. I think they're hurting their own cause, but there's really two groups here. There's the protesters over the death in Minnesota, and the other group are those who are just taking advantage, and that's who I'm talking about with the Antifa guys. That they'll seize upon any advantage to inject themselves into it, and as we've seen in a number of cities, the looting and whatnot is just it's going crazy. But that's what they want. They want a new big screen TV and so on, and they don't really give a heck what happened in Minnesota.
Well, so you think that the sort of riot and the vandalism and the looting has been driven by, do you think it's sort of an Antifa, like centrally driven movement, that they were just ready and waiting to seize on the opportunity? We sort of saw that with the blockades that happened this year earlier in Canada, when the railways were just completely blocked, and it didn't really seem to be about the environment or sympathy with the few Aboriginal chiefs or heretic chiefs that were opposed to it, but really it was just the same Antifa stuff. Like, they hate capitalism, they hate our society, they want to tear it all down. How are they so quick to organize it? Do you really think that is the driving force at this point?
Well, there's a couple of aspects there where there's some Antifa guys in most cities. We have them in Canada too, and we saw them in Montreal last week and in Toronto, and to a smaller degree in Vancouver. But we also know that somebody, we think it was George Soros, but we're not sure yet, was flying these guys into Minnesota, into Minneapolis. And I'd be willing to bet that they've flown their way around the country a little bit, just to make sure everything goes as badly as possible.
And so what is the point of it? I mean, you mentioned a second ago that some people are just interested in, a new flat screen TV, and we've certainly seen that in Montreal, the looting of a guitar store. I don't really know what grabbing a few, luxury guitars has to do with justice for police brutality. But again, there almost seems to be two different types of people. Those that are kind of just in it because they have nothing better to do and they're angry, and sure, if they can get some free sneakers, they're going to go for it. But then the other type, the type that are really angry, dressed in black, organizing, like you say, perhaps even funded. How do these two groups find each other and align each other? Do they have much in common, or are they just sort of protesting side by side?
You may have missed what I said, Candice, but one of the groups is the actual true protesters who are protesting the death caused apparently by a police officer. It was on video, and it was just horrific for anybody who saw it. And that's one group. The other group, I think, is the social misfits, the Antifa. They are, and there's several aspects of them, but they're the ones who want to cause as much trouble as possible, bearing in mind that until the Antifa people showed up, the protesters were fairly peaceful.
The only thing that I would slightly disagree with you on is I would say that there's probably three groups of people. Then there's the peaceful protesters that are Black Lives Matter people, and not solely Black people, but Black Lives Matter kind of movement. And then there's the violent people, and the violent people are kind of two groups of people. One, the mostly suburban, mostly white Antifa members, and then there's also a group of rioters that seem like they're more like inner city Black kids that don't really have a lot going for them other than just seizing on this opportunity to get some, to loot and to raid.
I would agree with you there, Candice, but both the Antifa types and the inner city kids that are just starting trouble, they're both in it basically for the same reason, and that's there's an opportunity here. Let's use it to cause as much trouble as possible. What's disturbed me about it all is some of the exceptionally violent stuff. There's that woman who had her store, and they were coming after her store, so she went outside to try and stop them, and then her husband, who was inside the store, came out to try and defend her, and they beat them both. I mean, there's no, if you run away with a black screen TV or a big screen TV, I understand what your motivation was as much as I disagree with it. But if you beat somebody just because they're there, I don't get that at all.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of really unfortunate messages that are being sort of portrayed, Leo. Like even just through the graffiti that you see, I've seen, an eye for an eye. The idea, I've seen someone spray paint, kill one back, as in like kill a police officer back. So, one of my issues that I'm having, and again, I would say that I'm very sympathetic with the protesters. I think that there are some legitimate grievances, and obviously the death of George Floyd is an example of something that was, as we both agree, I think, in most decent people. Actually, I've yet to see anyone say that this wasn't an instance of police brutality and that it wasn't a bad kill. And the officer that's done it is now being charged. I think that the charge has been upgraded to second-degree murder, and he's been fired, and all that kind of stuff. So there has been some wheels of justice in motion. The other three officers who were there, who didn't do anything to help George Floyd, have also been charged with sort of aiding and abetting murder. I think those are the charges. But anyway, regardless of the legitimacy of the protests, when you see things evolve into chaos and violence and assault, you kind of have to wonder, why are these protesters still getting positive news coverage? Why do the mainstream media insist that this is a peaceful protest, and why aren't they covering some of the more unfortunate aspects of the rioting? Now, Leo, I know you're a policing expert, but I thought maybe you'd have an opinion as to the bias media coverage that we're seeing.
Well, some of the stuff I've seen has just been absolutely gobsmacking. When they're saying that they define these people, they're breaking and looting stores, and they're called protesters, and then when that doesn't continue to work for them, then they somehow pivot, and they're white supremacists. It makes no sense to me at all.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. We have seen some prominent left-wing voices in the U.S. and even some Democrats saying that the white people that are involved in the protests aren't Antifa, but they're actually white nationalists posing as Antifa. I haven't seen any evidence of that. From a policing standpoint, Leo, have you seen any evidence to support that? Why do you think they're making that claim?
Well, every event that I've watched that Antifa has been involved with, it's been primarily whites who live in their mom's basement, and the easiest way to describe them would be to call them losers. And they're just looking to go out. They're looking to find a cause, or at least a trigger event, and then they'll go out and do whatever it is they're going to do. But we look at some of the events in Portland when that young reporter, Andy Ngo, got attacked. I mean, it's senseless stuff.
Yeah, and it's really a travesty that the media only reports one side of it. Another kind of related question, Leo. Other observers that I've seen, and this one I feel is just almost like a head scratcher, but authorities in Minnesota, as well as the former UN ambassador to when Barack Obama was president, Susan Rice, they've made claims that the riots and violence have been instigated not by Antifa, not by white nationalists, not by Black Lives Matter, but infiltrated by foreign agents, perhaps Russian, again meddling in domestic affairs in the United States and pouring gasoline on the fire. What do you make of that that sort of speculation, I'll call it?
I've seen no evidence of that, and certainly the Minnesota police, whether it's Minneapolis or St. Paul, or the state troopers or the local sheriffs, nobody has ever mentioned anything like that. Susan Rice, as you recall from the early days of the Trump presidency, she just can't let go of the Russian conspiracy thing, and she really needs to.
Yeah, I mean, you could kind of say, if you were a foreign government trying to destabilize the United States, how would you do it? And pouring fire or pouring gasoline on this fire might be one, but I've yet to really see any evidence of that especially on a widespread level. But there certainly seems to be some speculation about it as well online. But you haven't seen anything that would support that.
No, in fact, the numbers that came out from I think it was Minneapolis police last night said that of the 127 arrests they made, 84 of them were from elsewhere in the United States, not from Minneapolis. So, I'm not sure what exactly that's telling us, except it's no longer a local cause celeb.
Well, and we've seen the protests and the riots quickly spread, and maybe this is a good opportunity, Leo. We've been compiling examples of police officers that have been attacked throughout these riots. So I think it's valuable to sort of just go through them. I'm going to do it really quickly, but this is just a cursory overview. I'm sure it's not as comprehensive as it could be because it hasn't been updated for the last 24 hours or so. But in Albany, New York, an officer was sent to the hospital after protesters threw bricks at him. In Atlanta, Georgia, an officer underwent surgery after a protester hit him with an ATV. Brockton, Massachusetts, one state trooper and a few local Brockton police officers suffered minor injuries. Buffalo, New York, 2 police officers were hit by a vehicle and one has his leg broken and pelvis shattered after the protest. Champaign, Illinois, several police officers suffered minor injuries after being assaulted allegedly. Cincinnati, Ohio, officer narrowly escaped death after a bullet struck his helmet. Columbia, South Carolina, 15 law enforcement personnel injured in a Saturday night riot. Chicago, 132 Chicago Department police officers injured in violent city riots. Danport, Iowa, plainclothes police officer injured after an individual opened fire from his vehicle. Denver, Colorado, 3 city police officers sent to the hospital after a hit and run. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 2 police officers sent to the hospital during a violent protest. Las Vegas, Nevada, 1 police officer put on life support after he was shot in the head during a violent protest. 12 additional officers are injured. Los Angeles, LAPD, 27 officers are injured during weekend rioting. Lynchburg, Virginia, several officers were shot during a protest, but none were injured. Minnesota, police officers shot during a protest at a precinct in the city was set on fire by protesters. Maryland, protesters injured 4 county police officers and damaged several police cruisers. New York City, dozens of NYPD police officers injured during weekend rioting. One video showing an officer being struck by a car in a hit and run. Oakland, Illinois, 3 officers injured during Monday's protests. Oakland, California, this is just absolutely heartbreaking. FBI officer David Patrick Underwood was shot and killed while providing security for a courthouse. Another officer was injured in the shooting. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, city police reported several assaults on its officers and multiple police cars set on fire. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 9 police officers hurt and sent to hospital. Richmond, Virginia, 2 officers hurt during a protest after being hit with a baseball bat and a beer bottle. Rhode Island, 9 officers injured amongst the rioting. Sacramento, California, 7 officers received minor injuries at the hands of violent protesters. Salt Lake City, Utah, 21 officers required medical care. San Antonio, Texas, 3 officers were injured after being hit with bricks and bottles. San Jose, California, several officers sustained injuries during a protest. 1 was sent to the hospital. Santa Ana, California, 2 officers have been taken to hospital after being hit in the head by projectiles thrown at them. St. Louis, Missouri, another heartbreaking story here. 77-year-old David Dorn, a retired police officer, was shot dead by looters. His death was broadcast live on Facebook. 4 other police officers were also shot in downtown St. Louis by violent protesters. And finally, Washington, D.C., 11 police officers injured during the protests. 1 officer received surgery after being hit by a brick in the head. Over 50 members of the Secret Service were also hurt during clashes. Some sustained injuries from Molotov cocktails. Now, Leo, I know that's a very long list, but I thought that, just to hear and understand the extent to which police are being attacked and injured and assaulted in these protests, and yet, we barely hear anything about that. So, what do you make of the lack of coverage, I'll say, and the violence towards police?
Well, there was another one you missed too, Candice, was last night an NYPD officer in Brooklyn was stabbed in the neck. The perp grabbed his gun when he went down and then used that gun to randomly attack and shoot 2 other police officers. Um, I don't know what to make of that. It's senseless would be my first word. Uh, they just want to start a war on police. And Heather McDonald wrote a good book a couple of years back called The War on Cops. And it was really a good book. And she examines a lot of reasons for these types of events. And it's, it's beyond the rational thinking of you and me or anybody else. But somehow they get it in their brain that they're going to do that. And then that's what they set out and do it.
Yeah, I'm a follower of Heather McDonald with the with the Manhattan Institute. She also had a column, Leo, in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, just kind of going through some of the statistics, because I think that there's a lot of, well, she proves that there's sort of a lot of misconceptions when it comes to policing. People are told and believe that Black people are far more likely to be killed by officers. She sort of debunks some of those myths and talks about how, there's been lots of comprehensive studies of police forces, and they don't really find what the protesters sort of accuse police of doing that. Do you have any criticisms of police, Leo? I know you and I both agree that the actions, from what we can see in the videos against George Floyd, seem absolutely abhorrent, and it doesn't seem like a good situation. One of the criticisms I've heard is that a lot of police officers have been told to stand down and sort of give the rioters space to riot, particularly at the beginning, and that there wasn't a lot of police presence in major cities. I know there's been video, for instance, in Santa Monica, California, of the police just standing there while people were looting. I believe this was happening all over the United States. Maybe you can comment on that and let me know if you have any other criticisms of police forces.
Well, in regards to the stand down orders, Candice, I mean, that's not from the police leadership. That's from the political, dare I call it, leadership in those cities. And I will note as well that every one of these cities that had these incidents over the course of the last 9 days or so are all Democrat-run cities. If you look at New York, you've got a Democrat governor, Cuomo. You've got a Democrat mayor who's as left as it gets, in de Blasio. And nobody will admit to giving a stand down order. De Blasio did admit to saying go light on them. If you handcuff the police are going to have a really hard time doing their job.
And how about anything more? We're hearing a lot about systemic problems in police forces and how police brutality is a major problem. Do you think that any of those arguments have credence, or do you think it's just sort of ideological hyperbole?
Yeah, not really. I mean, there's occasional idiots like that guy in Minneapolis. I mean, there's no excuse for what he did in any way, shape, or form. Uh, was it what we even don't know if that was racist driven. We just know that he knelt on the guy's neck when he was already secured and killed him. He kneeled there for over 3.5 seconds until after the guy stopped breathing. I mean, there's no excuse for that. Was that racist driven? we don't know yet, and I'm sure we probably won't even know until it goes to trial.
Yeah, we can find out what the guy's attitude was like and why he was targeting George Floyd in that situation. I know we talked about this a little bit offline, Leo, but I thought we could talk about it again because we were kind of reminiscing. About 10 years ago, there was a huge riot. Well, at the time, it was considered a huge riot in Vancouver, which is the city that I'm from, and the city that you live in. And it was after the Canucks lost in the Stanley Cup Finals against the Bruins. There was a big riot. It was 2011, and it was sort of seen as like a national disgrace. Like Vancouver developed a reputation as this like city that had this big riot, and I remember as a Canuck fan, I was mocked for a long time by a lot of people. But when you look back at that riot and you compare it to what's going on today, even if you compare what's going on in 2020 to the sort of civil unrest that we saw after a man was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014, which prompted the whole hands up, don't shoot thing, which I think that was a little bit overblown. I think that the idea that this guy has hands up has been thoroughly debunked. But anyway, we can talk about that a little bit. But maybe you could just discuss how riots have evolved in the last decade, why things were so calm relatively, in 2011 with that Vancouver riot compared to the riots we're seeing today.
Well, typically a riot, such as the 2011 riot in Vancouver, is very localized. Uh, you know, it, th- there's no question that they went out that night right after the third period and just started rioting right away, right outside the CBC studios on Georgia Street. But typically they're very localized. I've seen a number of them. I've been in a number of them as a police officer. And, what happens in Ottawa, as an example, doesn't necessarily trickle over to Toronto or whatever else. What we're seeing in this particular case seems to have grown a life of its own, Candice.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it's ongoing, and there doesn't really seem to be an end in sight. I mean, we're almost coming on a week now. I think it might be a week, and we're still seeing videos emerge, like you said, still seeing police assaulted in major U.S. cities. Well, Leo, I really appreciate your time. Just one more question. You've had a career in police officers. You've seen it from the other side, from the side of the officers. For people out there watching, maybe even people that don't agree with what you and I are saying, what would you like people to know about police officers and the police force and what it's like to be a police, particularly a police trying to protect a city in the middle of a riot?
From a police perspective, the police know that their job is to serve and protect the society, and they will do that job in the same way that emergency healthcare workers know their job is to go and deal with whatever health emergency they're dealing with, and they take appropriate precautions, as police do as well. Back to my earlier point about the stand down orders, there's nothing more ridiculous in my mind than a local leadership, a mayor or whatever, uh, telling a police leader on the ground how he has to respond. First off, the mayor knows absolutely nothing about police work. He knows nothing about crowd control or how to put down a riot or anything along those lines. And yet he's saying, for purely political reasons, that the police should stand down. And I just think that's abhorrent.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially because things change on the ground and the situation can be really intense and scary, as we know, just even hearing that long list of assaults and attacks against police officers. These people are obviously putting their own life on the line and doing it because they have a sense of duty and that it's their job. So, well, Leo, thank you so much for helping us understand and help shine some light on some of the issues regarding policing in both the United States and Canada. Really, really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome, Candice.